There's a moment captured in grainy footage from late 1944 where Hitler emerges from his bunker. If you look closely at his eyes, you can see something that wasn't there before. Not fear exactly. Something worse. The empty recognition that everything is already over. His hands shake uncontrollably. His left arm hangs limp. He shuffles like an old man, even though he's only 55. But it's his eyes that tell the real story. They're the eyes of someone who knows with absolute certainty that he's lost, but can't admit it out loud. The question that haunts historians is when exactly Hitler realized the war was unwinnable. Was it after Stalingrad? After D-Day? After the Battle of the Bulge failed? Or was there a single moment, a specific piece of news or realization, where the truth became undeniable even to him? Today, we're going to trace Hitler's psychological journey from absolute confidence to desperate denial to final recognition that Nazi Germany was doomed. Let's start at the peak of Hitler's confidence because you need to understand how high he climbed before the fall. In the summer of 1940, Hitler stood at the pinnacle of power. France had fallen in 6 weeks. The British army had been evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving its equipment behind. Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg were all conquered by the Germans. The German military seemed unstoppable. Hitler had proven all the doubters wrong. The generals who said blitzkrieg wouldn't work. The diplomats who said Britain and France would fight. The economists who said Germany couldn't afford war. All of them had been wrong and Hitler had been right. This created in Hitler an absolute confidence in his own judgment that would prove catastrophic. Hitler genuinely believed himself to be a genius. He believed Providence had chosen him to reshape Europe. His early successes seemed to confirm this belief. He'd rebuilt Germany from the wreckage of World War I. He'd annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia without firing a shot. He'd conquered most of Europe in less than 2 years. Why wouldn't he believe he was destined for greatness? This belief blinded him to reality. When his generals tried to tell him things weren't going well, he dismissed them. When intelligence reports contradicted his assumptions, he rejected them. When facts didn't fit his worldview, he ignored them. This willful blindness meant that when reality finally became undeniable, it hit him all the harder. The first crack in Hitler's confidence likely occurred in late 1940 when Britain refused to surrender. Hitler expected that after France fell, Britain would negotiate peace. It made sense from his perspective. Britain was isolated, its army was battered, and its ally, France, was defeated. Why keep fighting? But Churchill refused to negotiate. Britain kept fighting, kept bombing Germany, kept building up its forces. This was the first indication that Hitler's understanding of his enemies might be flawed. But it was a small crack. Hitler convinced himself that Britain was being irrational, that they'd eventually see reason or be conquered. He moved forward with plans for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941, and initially it seemed like another stunning success. German forces advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. They captured millions of Soviet soldiers. They reached the outskirts of Moscow. Hitler believed the Soviet Union would collapse just like France had. He famously said you have to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come tumbling down. But the Soviet Union didn't collapse. The Red Army kept fighting. Soviet factories kept producing. The Russian winter set in, and German forces, unprepared for winter warfare, started suffering terribly. For the first time, Hitler faced an enemy that absorbed his best blows and counterattacked with even greater force. The failure to capture Moscow in late 1941 should have been Hitler's wake-up call. His generals pleaded with him to allow a strategic retreat to defensible winter positions. Hitler refused. He ordered his armies to hold every position, no matter the cost. This worked in the sense that it prevented a complete rout, but it also meant German forces stayed in exposed positions throughout a brutal winter they weren't equipped for. Tens of thousands of German soldiers suffered from frostbite. The equipment froze and failed. Supply lines stretched to the breaking point. The invincible German army was learning what Napoleon had learned over a century before. Russia in winter is a different kind of enemy. Then came December 1941 and two events that sealed Germany's fate, even if Hitler didn't realize it yet. First, the German offensive toward Moscow definitively failed. The Soviets launched a counteroffensive, pushing German forces back from the capital. This was the first major German defeat of the war. Second, and even more significantly, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and Hitler declared war on the United States. This might have been Hitler's single most catastrophic strategic decision. Germany was already fighting Britain and the Soviet Union. Now he added the United States, with its enormous industrial capacity and population, to the list of enemies. Historians still debate why Hitler did this. Some say he hoped it would distract America from its involvement in the European continent. Others say he felt obligated to honor his alliance with Japan. Whatever his reasoning, it was a death sentence for Nazi Germany. Did Hitler realize the significance of the United States' entry into the war? Probably not immediately. He'd convinced himself that America was weak, divided, and militarily incompetent. This was more Nazi racial ideology talking than a realistic assessment. Hitler genuinely believed that a democracy full of immigrants and different races couldn't possibly compete with Germany's supposed Aryan unity and discipline. This belief was so wrong it's almost funny, except for the millions of people who died because of it. America's entry into the war meant Germany now faced enemies on all sides with a combined population and industrial capacity many times larger than Germany's own. The math was simple and brutal. Germany couldn't win a war of attrition against those odds. The year 1942 brought more evidence that the war was turning against Germany, but Hitler continued to reject reality. The German summer offensive in the Soviet Union aimed for the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad. Initially successful, the offensive eventually stalled. Stalingrad became the focal point of an increasingly brutal battle. Hitler ordered that the town be taken at all costs and held regardless of the outcome. When the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive in November 1942, they encircled the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad. Over 200,000 German soldiers were trapped. Hitler's generals begged him to allow the Sixth Army to break out while there was still time. Hitler refused. He ordered them to hold position and promised supplies by air that never materialized adequately. The Sixth Army held out for months in increasingly desperate conditions. Soldiers starved and froze. Ammunition ran out. Medical supplies were exhausted. By February 1943, the surviving Germans, numbering around 90,000 men, surrendered. It was the first time an entire German army had been forced to surrender. The psychological impact was enormous. For German soldiers and civilians, it shattered the myth of invincibility. For Hitler, it should have been the moment of reckoning. Here was undeniable proof that German forces could be defeated, that Hitler's orders could lead to disaster, that the war might not be winnable. But Hitler's response was to double down on denial. He raged about betrayal, about generals not following orders aggressively enough, about anything except the possibility that his strategy was fundamentally flawed. Throughout 1943, the tide continued to turn against Germany on all fronts. In North Africa, German forces under Rommel were defeated, and the Afrika Korps ceased to exist as a fighting force. The Allies invaded Sicily and then Italy, knocking Germany's main European ally out of the war. In the Soviet Union, Germany's attempt to regain initiative with the Kursk offensive failed catastrophically. The Red Army was now larger, better equipped, and increasingly competent operationally. They began a series of offensives that would push German forces back toward Germany itself. In the Atlantic, the U-boat campaign was failing as Allied anti-submarine tactics improved. In the air, Allied bombers were hitting German cities and industrial targets with increasing intensity. On every front, Germany was being pushed back. Did Hitler realize during 1943 that Germany was losing? He must have known at some level. But humans have an incredible capacity for denial, especially when admitting the truth means acknowledging that everything you've built is collapsing. Hitler convinced himself that Germany could still win through superior will and fighting spirit. He convinced himself that miracle weapons under development would change the course of the war. He convinced himself that the Allied coalition would fall apart because their ideological differences were too great. He grasped at any rationalization that allowed him to avoid facing reality. His inner circle fed this denial. No one wanted to tell Hitler the truth because he'd react with rage and blame. The year 1944 brought events that should have made denial impossible even for Hitler. In June, the Allies successfully landed at Normandy and began the liberation of Western Europe. Hitler had expected the invasion, had prepared defenses, and had positioned forces to respond. But the scale of Allied logistics and firepower overwhelmed German defenses. Within weeks, the Allies had established an unbreakable beachhead and were advancing inland. Meanwhile, in the east, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration, a massive offensive that destroyed German Army Group Center. In one summer month, the Germans lost over 300,000 soldiers and hundreds of miles of territory. It was a disaster on a scale that exceeded even the Battle of Stalingrad. By late summer 1944, the strategic situation was hopeless. Germany was being crushed between advancing Soviet armies from the east and American, British, and Canadian forces from the west. German industry was being destroyed by round-the-clock bombing. Oil production was crippled. The transportation network was in ruins. The army was suffering losses it couldn't replace. Yet Hitler still talked about victory. He planned a major offensive in the West that would split the Allied forces and force them to negotiate a peace. This became known as the Battle of the Bulge, which was launched in December 1944. It was Germany's last major offensive, and it's worth looking at it as a window into Hitler's mental state. The Battle of the Bulge was based on fantasy. Hitler believed he could achieve strategic surprise, that his depleted forces could break through American lines, capture the port of Antwerp before the Allies could respond, and that this would force Britain and America to negotiate a separate peace. Every assumption was wrong. Yes, the Germans achieved tactical surprise and made initial gains. But the offensive was doomed from the start. Germany didn't have the fuel to sustain the advance. They didn't have air superiority. The Americans, after initially being shocked, responded effectively with overwhelming force. Within weeks, the German offensive was defeated, and German troops were back where they started, having lost men and equipment they desperately needed for defending Germany itself. Some historians argue that the Battle of the Bulge was when Hitler finally realized the war was lost. The offensive had been his last hope. He'd committed resources Germany couldn't afford to lose. When it failed, there was nothing left. No reserves, no miracle weapons that would actually work, no realistic hope of victory. Accounts from people who saw Hitler in early 1945 describe a broken man. His health had deteriorated dramatically. He suffered from Parkinson's disease, making his hands shake uncontrollably. He was addicted to a cocktail of drugs prescribed by his doctor. He rarely left his bunker in Berlin. When he did emerge, footage shows him shuffling along, an old man prematurely aged by stress and illness. But even in 1945, even as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, Hitler clung to delusions. He ordered phantom armies that no longer existed to launch counterattacks against them. He raged at generals for retreating when staying would have meant annihilation. He convinced himself that the alliance between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union would collapse, that they'd stop fighting Germany and fight each other. He believed Frederick the Great's miracle, where Prussia had been saved at the last moment by the death of an enemy ruler, would happen for him. When Franklin Roosevelt died in April 1945, Hitler briefly thought his miracle had arrived, that America would now stop fighting. It didn't, and reality kept closing in. The final days in the bunker were surreal. Hitler married Eva Braun, his longtime companion. He wrote his political testament, blaming everyone but himself for Germany's defeat. He raged against the German people for not being strong enough to win. He ordered the destruction of Germany's remaining infrastructure because if he couldn't rule Germany, no one should have it. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet forces blocks away, Hitler committed suicide. Even at the very end, he couldn't face the consequences of his actions. He couldn't face trial, couldn't face capture, couldn't face seeing the world he'd tried to create destroyed. So when exactly did Hitler realize he couldn't win? The truth is, there probably wasn't a single moment. It was a gradual process of reality breaking through layers of denial. Small realizations that were quickly buried. Moments of clarity followed by renewed faith in impossible scenarios. The human mind, especially one like Hitler's, is remarkably adept at rejecting information that contradicts deeply held beliefs. Hitler had built his entire identity around being the leader who would reshape Europe and establish a thousand-year Reich. Admitting the war was lost meant admitting his life's work was a failure. That's almost impossible for anyone to do, let alone someone with Hitler's psychology. But if we had to identify key moments when reality forced itself on Hitler's consciousness, several stand out. The failure to defeat Britain in 1940 showed that his enemies wouldn't simply collapse as he expected. The failure to capture Moscow in 1941 demonstrated that Blitzkrieg had limits. Stalingrad in early 1943 showed that German forces could be decisively defeated. The summer of 1944, marked by D-Day and Operation Bagration, showed that Germany was being overwhelmed on all fronts simultaneously. The failure of the Battle of the Bulge in early 1945 showed that Germany had no realistic path to anything but total defeat. Each of these moments chipped away at Hitler's delusions until there was nothing left but the reality he'd tried so hard to deny. What's fascinating and terrifying about studying Hitler's psychological state is seeing how delusion works at the highest levels of power. Hitler wasn't stupid. He had a kind of cunning political intelligence that served him well in the 1930s. However, intelligence without wisdom, without self-awareness, without willingness to accept reality, leads to catastrophic decisions. Hitler surrounded himself with people who either believed his delusions or were too afraid to challenge them. This created an echo chamber where reality couldn't penetrate until it was far too late. Information that contradicted Hitler's worldview was dismissed as defeatism or treachery. This meant Hitler was making decisions based on fantasy rather than facts. Millions of people paid the cost of Hitler's inability to face reality. If Hitler had sought peace in 1943 when the war was clearly turning against Germany, millions of lives might have been saved. But Hitler couldn't do that because it would mean admitting defeat. So the war continued for 2 more years. More soldiers died. More civilians were killed in bombing raids and artillery barrages. The Holocaust continued, with millions of Jews and other victims murdered even as Germany was losing the war. The final year of the war was particularly pointless from a German perspective. Everyone except Hitler could see the battle was lost. But because Hitler couldn't admit it, the killing continued until Germany was literally destroyed. There's a broader lesson here about leadership and reality. Leaders who can't face bad news, who punish people for telling them the truth, who surround themselves with yes men, and who believe their own propaganda often make catastrophic decisions. The signs were there for years that Germany couldn't win a sustained war against the combined forces of the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States. German generals tried to tell Hitler this. Economic advisors explained the production numbers. But Hitler rejected all of it because accepting it meant questioning his own judgment and his entire worldview. This refusal to face reality didn't just cost Hitler, it cost millions of lives and left Germany in ruins. By the time Hitler died in his bunker, the Reich he'd promised would last 1,000 years had lasted 12 years and was utterly destroyed. Germany was occupied, divided, its cities in ruins, its population traumatized. The Holocaust killed 6 million Jews and millions of others. The war Hitler started killed over 50 million people worldwide. All of this was because one man couldn't face reality, couldn't admit his mistakes, and couldn't see that his vision was leading to catastrophe. The tragedy is that Hitler probably did realize, somewhere in his mind, that he'd lost long before the end. However, his psychology, ideology, and his entire sense of self wouldn't allow him to admit it or act on it. The footage of Hitler from late 1944 and early 1945 is haunting because you can see the denial cracking, the shaking hands, the shuffling walk, the dead eyes. This is a man who knows he's lost but can't say it, who's trapped by his own propaganda, his own myth, his own inability to face truth. There's no sympathy due to Hitler, given the enormity of his crimes. But there is a lesson in watching how completely their own delusions can destroy a human being. Hitler went from master of Europe to a broken shell in a bunker, destroyed not just by his enemies, but by his own refusal to see reality. That's the real answer to when Hitler realized he couldn't win. He probably learned it multiple times starting in 1941 or 1942. But he couldn't let himself accept what he knew. And that denial, that inability to face truth, led directly to his death and the death of millions. If this deep dive into Hitler's psychology and the gradual collapse of his delusions gave you a new understanding of how the war ended, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. We're exploring the human stories behind historical events, the psychological realities that shape decisions, and the moments when individuals faced truths they couldn't accept. Thanks for watching. Remember, the most dangerous person isn't the one who doesn't know the truth. It's the one who knows the truth but refuses to accept it. I'll lose to bad luck and superior numbers.